February 14th, 1857, Savannah, Georgia. While lovers across the nation exchanged sweet tokens of affection, while roses bloomed in parlor vases and chocolate melted on eager tongues, something darker was stirring in the grand Ashworth mansion on Bull Street. On this day of hearts and promises, 6 souls would meet their maker, not by Cupid's arrow but by hands that had stirred their tea, mended their clothes and whispered "yes ma'am" through gritted teeth for 23 years. Her name was Selena, though they called her Girl, or the Quiet One. She was neither girl nor quiet when the darkness finally claimed them. She was justice wearing an apron, vengeance carrying a silver tray, memory sharp as the blade she'd hidden beneath her mattress for 3 months. They had taught her many things in their grand house: how to press linens until they gleamed like fresh snow, how to serve brandy without trembling, how to disappear into wallpaper when masters entertained. But the most valuable lesson they'd given her was this: how cruelty compounds like interest, growing heavier each day until the weight becomes unbearable. Tonight, that weight would shift. Before we continue with this haunting tale of retribution, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These buried stories need witnesses to keep them alive. The Ashworth mansion stood like a monument to stolen dreams, its white columns gleaming in the gaslight while shadows danced between Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast rainbow fractals across mahogany floors, polished by hands that would never own such luxury. The dining room sparkled with Valentine's preparations, imported chocolates arranged on silver platters, French wine breathing in crystal, decanters, roses cut fresh from the garden where slaves had labored since dawn. Laughter echoed through corridors lined with portraits of dead patriarchs, their painted eyes following movement with the same cold calculation their descendants had inherited. Master Charles Ashworth raised his glass, his face flushed with wine and privilege, surrounded by his brood: wife Margaret, 17-year-old Catherine, 15-year-old James, 12-year-old Elizabeth, 9-year-old Thomas, and 6-year-old Mary, the baby who still believed the world was gentle. Beneath their feet, the foundation groaned with secrets. In the quarters behind the kitchen, where gaps between wooden planks let winter wind slice through threadbare blankets, other souls counted different blessings. They counted scars instead of silver. They measured time not by clock hands, but by the rhythm of the whip, the cycle of planting and harvest, the endless rotation of bodies worn down to bone. The contrast was a living wound: warmth above, cold below, abundance upstairs, hunger in the cellar, love celebrated in the parlor while families were torn apart in the marketplace. The very air seemed to hold its breath, as if the house itself knew that balance would soon be restored. The debts long overdue were about to be collected with interest. Tonight the scales would tip. Selena moved through shadows like smoke, her bare feet silent on floors she'd scrubbed 10,000 times. Her hands, those careful, calloused hands that had braided hair and bandaged wounds and prepared meals and buried children. These hands remembered everything. They remembered the texture of coarse rope, the weight of iron shackles, the sting of cold water on open wounds. But more than that, they remembered love. She had been born on a plantation outside Charleston, delivered by her grandmother's weathered hands into a world that had already decided her worth. $300 at market, less if she proved too willful. Her mother, Celia, had sung to her in the tobacco fields, songs that carried messages older than memory, melodies that mapped roots to freedom through minor keys and coded verses. When Selena was 8, they sold Celia downriver to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. The last thing her mother had whispered was, "Remember who you are, baby girl. Remember what they take can't touch what they can't see." What they couldn't see was how Selena absorbed everything: which herbs could heal and which could harm, how to read the master's moods in the set of their shoulders, where the floorboards creaked, and which servants could be trusted with secrets. Her grandmother, before she passed, had taught her the old ways: how plants held power, how patience was a weapon sharper than any blade, how memory itself could become a form of resistance. At 15, Selena had fallen in love with Samuel, a field hand whose laugh could chase away the darkest thoughts. They had planned to jump the broom in spring, to steal whatever happiness they could in a world determined to deny them joy. But Master Charles had other plans. He sold Samuel to pay gambling debts, ripping him away on a Tuesday morning while Selena watched from the kitchen window, her heart breaking so completely she thought the sound might shatter glass. She never spoke Samuel's name again, but she carved it into her memory like scripture. The years that followed hardened something essential inside her. She learned to smile while planning, to serve while observing, to bend without breaking. When little Mary was born, Selena had been chosen as her nursemaid. She had rocked that child to sleep with lullabies her own male. Other had sung, had kissed scraped knees and dried tears with tenderness that felt like betrayal. Because how do you love the children of monsters? How do you care for innocence born into guilt? But innocence, she had learned, was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. These children would grow up to own her children. Little Thomas already pulled slave girls' hair for entertainment. James had started using the whip at 12. Even sweet Elizabeth had learned to order grown men around like dogs. The planning had taken months, each detail considered like pieces of a chess game where losing meant her life. But losing, she realized, would be freedom. Death would be escape, and taking them with her, that would be justice. She had studied their routines with the patience of a hunter tracking prey. Master Charles always drank 3 glasses of wine with dinner, never more, never less, his discipline as rigid as his cruelty. Margaret took laudanum for her nerves, keeping a bottle in her nightstand that she thought no one knew about. The children followed patterns too. Catherine read by candlelight until midnight. James snuck cigars in the library. Elizabeth collected pressed flowers. Thomas played with tin soldiers, and Mary slept with a cloth doll Selena had sewn for her. Each family member became a problem to solve, a lock that required the right key. Master Charles, the patriarch who had bought and sold human flesh like livestock, who had raped 3 slave girls and sold their children, who had once beaten a man to death for looking him in the eye. His key would be the knife, quick and personal, close enough to see recognition dawn in his eyes. Margaret, the mistress who smiled while ordering whippings, who pinched slave children until they cried and called it discipline, who had watched her husband's violence with the detached interest of someone observing weather patterns. Her key would be the pillow, soft as the comfort she'd never shown, gentle as the mercy she'd never given. Catherine, beautiful, vain Catherine who used slave girls as dress-up dolls, who had pushed a pregnant woman down the stairs for moving too slowly, who had inherited her father's cruelty but refined it into art. The silk scarf she was so proud of, imported from Paris with money earned from human misery. James, already a master in training, already drunk on power at 15, who had taken a riding crop to a slave boy for spilling water. The fire poker, heavy and brutal, fitting for someone who had never learned restraint. Elizabeth, sweet-faced Elizabeth, who seemed gentlest but was perhaps most dangerous, who had learned to smile while inflicting pain, who had convinced her father to separate a mother from her infant as punishment for a broken dish. The letter opener, sharp and precise as her calculated cruelty. Thomas, just 9 but already corrupted, who had kicked a slave child down the stairs and laughed when the boy's arm broke, his toy soldier, the metal one with the sharp edges he loved so much. And Mary, innocent Mary who had never chosen this world but would grow up to perpetuate it. For her, the gentle touch, the quick sleep, the mercy none of the others would receive. February 14th arrived dressed in morning frost that made the world look clean, deceptive in its beauty. The house hummed with preparation, cook preparing the Valentine's feast, maids arranging flowers, stable hands grooming horses for the evening carriage ride Master Charles had planned. Everyone had their role in the performance of prosperity, the theater of civilization built on bones. Selena moved through her duties like a woman walking underwater, each motion deliberate and dreamlike. She served breakfast with steady hands, helped Catherine dress for receiving callers, minded baby Mary while Margaret planned the evening's entertainment. To watching eyes, she was the same Selena she had always been, quiet, reliable, invisible. But inside, she was transforming. Each breath drew her closer to a moment that would define not just her death, but her meaning. She was becoming something beyond their understanding, not servant, not slave, but force of nature. She was becoming their judgment. The knife came first, waiting under her pillow like a secret prayer. She had stolen it 3 months ago, working it slowly from the kitchen inventory, hiding it so carefully that Cook had assumed it was simply misplaced. She had sharpened it on the whetstone when the house slept, tested its edge on strips of cloth until it could part fabric like water. The herbs came next: oleander from the garden, foxglove from the meadow, pokeweed from the forest edge, plants her grandmother had taught her to recognize, flowers that could heal in small doses but harbored death in their beauty. She had dried them slowly, ground them carefully, measured them precisely, enough to bring sleep, deep and final. The opportunity would come with dinner. She had volunteered to serve, had insisted when Cook suggested sending another girl. This was her moment, her movement, her music to conduct. As sunset painted the sky the color of spilled wine, the family gathered in the dining room for their Valentine celebration. They entered like actors taking the stage, each costume perfect, each smile practiced. Master Charles wore his best coat, the one with gold buttons purchased with profits from selling children. Margaret glittered with diamonds that caught light like tears frozen in stone. The children were dressed like dolls, beautiful and terrible in their innocence. The irony was perfect, a celebration of love in a house that had never known its meaning. Dinner began with toasts to love, to family, to prosperity that never acknowledged its source. They laughed at private jokes while Selena poured wine, served soup, cleared plates with the invisible efficiency they had trained into her. They spoke about her as if she wasn't there, planning her future assignments, discussing whether to breed her to the new field hand, debating her market value like she was livestock. She listened to it all with the patience of a spider waiting in her web. The moment came with dessert: chocolate cake layered with cream, strawberries dipped in sugar, delicacies that slaves would never taste. As she served the sweet wine that would accompany the final course, she added her own ingredients. A pinch of powder here, a few drops of tincture there, measured doses that would work slowly, gently, allowing her time to complete her work before anyone realized what was happening. 20 minutes. That's how long the herbs would take to pull them into sleep. She cleared the final plates and retreated to the kitchen, listening to their voices fade from laughter to murmur to silence. One by one, they would excuse themselves. Charles to his study for brandy, Margaret to her room for laudanum, the children to their beds for story time and prayers. They would fall asleep thinking of tomorrow's plans, of next week's parties, of lives that stretched endlessly ahead. They were wrong about the endlessly part. Charles went first, slumping over his ledger books where he recorded human property like inventory. The brandy glass slipped from his fingers, amber liquid spreading across pages that documented 20 years of buying and selling souls. Selena found him there an hour later, his face peaceful in death, more rest than he had earned in life. The knife entered just below his ribs, angled upward toward the heart, a technique her grandmother had taught her for slaughtering pigs. But this was no pig. This was the man who had owned her body, who had tried to own her spirit, who had failed to understand that some things could never be possessed. She whispered Samuel's name as she worked, speaking it aloud for the first time in 8 years. Margaret was next, unconscious in her four-poster bed, surrounded by silk pillows and French perfume. The pillow pressed over her face with steady pressure, held until the struggling stopped, until justice was served soft as the cotton that had built this house. Margaret had smiled while children were torn from mothers. Now she would never smile again. The children came quickly after that, each death tailored to the life it ended. Catherine, with the silk scarf she loved so much, wound around her throat like a lover's embrace. James with the fire poker, swift and sure, payment for every blow he had delivered. Elizabeth with the letter opener, precise as surgery, final as the sentences she had whispered to her father's ear. Thomas with his toy soldier, the metal edges finding vulnerable places, teaching him that games had consequences. And finally Mary, sweet Mary, who had never chosen this world but would have inherited its sins. For her, the gentlest touch, hands that had rocked her to sleep now guiding her to deeper dreams. When it was finished, when justice had been served in 6 courses, Selena sat in the parlor among the Valentine's decorations, surrounded by roses that would wilt, chocolates that would spoil, wine that would turn to vinegar. She had become something terrible and necessary, the hand of balance, the voice of the voiceless, the answer to prayers no one dared speak aloud. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She sat in her blood-stained dress and waited for discovery, for arrest, for the final act of a play that had been 23 years in the making. Dawn came gray and cold, bringing with it the cook who found the bodies, the neighbors who heard the screaming, the constables who came with chains. They found Selena exactly where she had waited, hands folded in her lap, face calm as a death mask, eyes holding secrets they would never understand. The trial was a performance, theater for a town that needed to believe in its own righteousness. They paraded her through streets lined with curious faces, white faces that had never questioned where their comfort came from, that had never counted the cost in human suffering. The prosecutor called her a monster, a savage, a cautionary tale about the dangers of showing kindness to inferior races. But when they asked her to speak, to explain her actions, to beg for mercy, Selena stood tall as a queen, addressing her subjects. Her voice, unused to being heard in courtrooms, carried the weight of generations. "You ask me why," she said, words cutting through the humid air like prophecy. "You taught me why. You taught me how cruelty compounds, how pain passes from hand to hand like inheritance. You taught me that some debts can only be paid in blood. You taught me everything I needed to know." The judge sentenced her to hang, as if death was punishment rather than release, as if they could kill what they had created. The crowd cheered, believing justice was being served, never understanding that justice had already visited their fine houses, their clean streets, their civilized lives built on stolen dreams. The hanging came on a Tuesday morning, March 3rd, 1857. The town gathered like it was a celebration, bringing children in picnic baskets, treating execution like entertainment. They built the gallows in the town square, constructing it from wood that slaves had cut, rope that slaves had twisted, nails that slaves had forged. Selena walked to her death wearing the same dress she had worn to serve their final meal, stained with evidence of her work but cleaned as best she could manage. She climbed the 13 steps without assistance, her head held high, her eyes scanning the crowd not for sympathy but for understanding. She found it in other faces like hers, dark eyes that held recognition, that understood what she had done and why. When they asked for final words, she spoke clearly enough for every ear to hear. "I am the daughter of daughters, the mother of mothers. I am what you made and what you feared. Remember that when you sleep in your fine beds, when you count your silver, when you forget that every comfort was built on bones, remember that we are always watching, always waiting, always remembering." The rope tightened, the platform dropped, and Selena passed from flesh into legend. But death was not the end. It was transformation. In the quarters behind grand houses, in the fields where cotton grew white as bleached bones, in the kitchens where meals were prepared by hands that remembered everything, her story spread like fever. They whispered it while hanging laundry, while churning butter, while rocking other people's babies to sleep. They sang it in coded spirituals that carried her name like prayer. She became the shadow behind the stove, the presence in empty hall. Ways, the reminder that patience was not submission, that silence was not acceptance. Masters began checking locks twice, tasting food before their children ate, watching their servants with new wariness. They installed bells in their bedrooms, bars on their windows, guards at their doors, but they could not guard against memory, could not lock out justice, could not bar the doors against what they had created in their own image. Selena became every slave who had ever dreamed of freedom, every mother who had lost children, every woman who had smiled while planning revenge. She was proof that the powerless were never truly powerless, that cruelty always found its way home, that love and loss could forge weapons sharper than any blade. Her story lived in whispered conversations, in knowing glances, in the sudden chill that would pass through rooms when masters spoke too harshly. She was the ghost in their guilt, the shadow of their sins, the price that privilege always, eventually, had to pay. What violence lies buried beneath our sugar? Whose cries seasoned our comfortable lives? In every fine house built on broken backs, in every fortune earned through human misery, her spirit walks still, patient as winter, certain as justice, inevitable as morning. She reminds us that some debts compound across generations, that some wounds never heal, that some stories demand to be told no matter how deep we try to bury them. Selena was not the first to resist, and she would not be the last. She was simply the one who taught a generation that monsters could be made to bleed, that power was not absolute, that even in the darkest times, choice remained. The choice to remember, the choice to resist, the choice to ensure that those who profit from suffering never sleep peacefully again. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the buried histories we rarely discuss, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a like if you believe these forgot. And voices deserve to be heard, and share this video with someone who needs to understand that resistance takes many forms. Hit that bell icon so you never miss the real stories that textbooks leave out, because truth, no matter how uncomfortable, deserves witnesses. Your support keeps these essential conversations alive.